Gentle viewers and gentlemen viewers and friends, near or far, welcome to this new episode of Shakespeare's Views on the News, simply titled Power. We are all familiar with the mythical War of Troy, originally described by Homer in the Iliad, which is a long poem followed by another long poem called the Odyssey. Both poems, in the country where I went to school, were standard subjects in secondary school, junior high, I believe they are called in the United States. Both, the Iliad and the Odyssey in their translation, of course. Following junior high, the equivalent of high school for me was an institution named Classical Lyceum, in which Lyceum we, the students, were involved in the task of translating sections of Homer's work from the original ancient Greek. Other writers and poets equally set themselves to describe the subject, the War of Troy and its consequences, including Shakespeare, notably in the play Troilus and Cressida. Various characters, both historical and mythical, appear in the play, particularly Ulysses, the strategist of the operations. Today he may be the chief of the CIA, perhaps. Not an improbable characterization, because the CIA's task is to destroy or subjugate countries from the inside, as for example in Tunisia, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, Ukraine, and others. In the same fashion, Ulysses devised the operation that eventually brought about the destruction of Troy. And this happened, as you know, thanks also to the famous Trojan horse, a kind of disguised and clever weapon of mass destruction. For the Greeks, filled the horse with soldiers, sent the horse as a gift of peace to the Trojans, the Trojans were sufficiently naive as to believe in the sincerity of the Greeks. They let the horse inside the city, and we know what happened next. As we know, the business of the Trojan horse has been converted into a metaphor that, even in these puzzling times of ours, has maintained a distinct relevance. Just as one example, we may think of Ukraine and remember Victoria Nudelman and her famous quotation, "We have spent $5 billion to achieve this result." The result being, of course, the bloody revolution in Ukraine in 2014, and the so far 1.5 million dead soldiers just in Ukraine, and all the Russian soldiers who have fallen as well. But returning to Homer's Iliad, the episode I'm referring to begins when and while things are not going too well for the Greeks, who are struggling to win the war. Ulysses blames the poor state of affairs on the lack of discipline and on the arrogance of warriors like Achilles, who may be considered with ample freedom of interpretation as a kind of younger Donald Trump of the time. Though I suspect that the analogy derived from Homer may leave Trump somewhat cold. Or perhaps it may think that the Homer in question may be the notorious Homer of The Simpsons, an incorrect comparison with which the original Homer may possibly take issue. Who knows? In the Iliad, while examining the state of the operations, Ulysses pronounces lines that can stand alone today as they stood about 2,500 years ago, the meaning referring to the paradox of power. They go as follow. Then everything includes itself in power, power into will, will into appetite, and appetite a universal wolf, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce a universal prey, and lust eat up himself. Evidence of Ulysses' analysis and or of the accuracy of his considerations on power is found in many following historical events, both of wide and local impact. In cases dealing with wars, but also in cases where treachery, greed, or lust or all three are combined. A state of affair usually producing confusion, contradiction, massive corruption, absurdity, and evidence of unadulterated greed. Condensing Ulysses' statement into the format of a text message, he says that the lust for power at all costs and without limits is self-destructing and leads to chaos. Those lines were true then as they are now, and the current chaos, death, and destruction in the Middle East are related, adequate, and extant evidence. Now, those who ride the tide of pomp that beats upon the high shores of the world, as King Henry V says in the play that bears his name, are not limited to the times of Henry V of England, that is, from 1386 to 1422. Those involved today may even shrug off. They may shrug off Ulysses' considerations as recorded by Homer. Keeping Ulysses' declaration in mind, as we know, two fundamental theses have clashed regarding the current Middle East war. One views Trump as a champion of anti-globalism, yet in practice there is ample evidence that he is an agent of the elites whom he claims to fight, while pretending to be what is usually referred to as a populist. Therefore, from this point of view, he is the right man at the right time and in the right place for those who massively profit from wars and stock exchange upheavals. Some opinionists claim that the apparent oddity of his policies and statements are evidence of a plan to wage different forms of war on the nations that make up the so-called BRICS association and prevent them from becoming a world dominant force. In short, to preserve America's dominant position. Others speak of a betrayal of his campaign promises and of the mental decline that makes him, among other things, subservient to Zionism as embodied by Israel's and Israel-American ruling elites. This point of view would easily and directly explain the recent war against Iran, familiarly called Epic Fury and familiarly renamed Epstein Fury for reasons that do not need an explanation. As a brief aside, not so long ago and during one of his visits, Netanyahu made a speech to both the Senate and the chamber congregated in the same hall. The speech was interrupted by many rounds of applause and standing ovations, and during the final applause at the end of the speech, nobody wanted to be seen as being the first to sit down. The hall had a distinct cartoonish appearance. I remember the episode, however, because at first I thought it was just my impression, but then I saw in the media that someone else had a similar comment in the days following that event. Going back to the current Middle East war, the theory of it being fought to fight the BRICS may make long-term strategic sense. But from another point of view, we are faced with another example of how real power generates both consensus and dissent within its logic, as it happened frequently in recent years. Today, thanks to two key elements, the game is increasingly easier. On the one hand, the eradication of any political culture founded on values that aren't merely vague, if not illusory, and on the other, the absolute pervasiveness of corporate media. However, there is yet another point of view, namely, Trump may somewhat confusedly believe himself to be an anti-globalist, but in reality he is playing into the hands of elites that he seeks to combat. In short, he's the right man at the right time in the right place. 4. What the oligarchies want, indeed what they need to continue their hold on power and to escape the system's contradictions, is precisely chaos, both to handle or reshape the monetary structure and to impose a different form of social engineering that will drive inequality to even greater levels while settling accounts with a traditionally troublesome democracy. Today, thanks to two key elements, the game is increasingly easier. On the one hand, the eradication of any political culture founded on values that are not merely vague, if not illusory, and on the other, the absolute pervasiveness of the corporate media. However, there is yet another point of view. Namely, Trump may somewhat confusedly believe himself to be an anti-globalist, but in reality he is playing into the hands of the elites that he seeks to control or combat. In short, he is the right man at the right time in the right place. For the ruling oligarchs need, in order to continue their hold on power and to escape the system's inherent contradiction, is precisely chaos, and for two reasons. One, to reshape the monetary structure, and two, to impose a different form of social engineering that will drive inequality to even greater levels. Plus, settling accounts with what remains of the troublesome democracy. From this point of view, Trump is the perfect candidate. For he, in principle, may appear as an adversary, but on the other hand, his displayed contempt of culture and open narcissistic personality make him easily malleable. In fact, anti-globalism can be reconciled with the fight against the BRICS, so-called BRICS, given that they are two antithetical entities. Yet another observation is applicable, as I read in a European newspaper, namely that real power generates both consensus and dissent within its logic, as we have experienced several times in recent years. And today, thanks to two key elements, the game is increasingly easier. On the one hand, the eradication of any political culture founded on values that are only vague, illusory, and stripped of meaning. On the other, the absolute pervasiveness and monopoly of the media, which, as we know, is owned and controlled 99% by those who have a direct interest in the game. From this point of view, it is not difficult to create the MAGA movement on one side and the No Kings movement on the other, and make them disappear once they have fulfilled their purpose. At first sight, it may seem paradoxical or impossible, especially to those who follow the so-called alternate as opposed to the corporate media. But in truth, notwithstanding advances in the popularity of other channels, alternative voices remain a minority. And the observations in the seminal book, The Society of the Spectacle, that was printed in 1967 and was written by Guérinard, remain extant. The book has been updated and reprinted several times up to quite recently to include the proverbial variations on the theme of the spectacle, that is. Incidentally, and taking a step back in the relatively recent history, the striving of the spectacle towards modernization and standardization together with all the other tendencies towards the simplification of society, was what in 1989 led to the Russian bureaucracy suddenly to convert itself to the current ideology of democracy, which, no value judgment here is implied, in practice It means the dictatorial freedom of the market, with some marginal allowance remaining for the rights of man, who will always, however, remain a spectator, which is also, as a definition, the homo spectator, who has no practical ability or means to influence the system. Homo spectators, that equally is and always has been easily malleable. Shakespeare has a large number of lines dedicated to the probably unresolvable problem of the malleability of crowds who can be led to believe anything, even if, or particularly when it does not make any sense. A fact that, in turn, led Oscar Wilde to coin that famous line, "I believe anything, provided it is quite incredible." This episode would extend beyond the patience of its viewers should I quote all Shakespeare's opinions on the subject. Just as an example, "You that stood up so much on the breath of garlic eaters," and that's from the play Coriolanus, where a conservative politician upbraids the tribunes of the people for having enraged Coriolanus against Rome. While electoral promises are best captured by the lines with which the rebel John Cade captures the attention of the unthinking crowd in Part 2 of King Henry VI. "And here, sitting upon London stone, I charge and command that, of the city's cost, the pissing conduit run nothing but claret wine, this first year of our reign." But returning to the main theme of this episode, globalism, that is, globalism is the ideological form in which neoliberalism has channeled itself to survive, and it needs to dominate the entire planet. As long as there are powerful and widespread pockets of resistance, globalism risks decaying within its own environment and drown it in its own waters. Therefore, globalism today needs to camouflage itself behind the face of an apparent enemy. This does not mean, of course, that it is always a success to employ an egotist devoid of any culture other than business, like Trump. Ultimately, it is the detail that matter, and the handling of the Iranian situation has been so cruel, yet so ephemeral and vacillating, that it has transformed a potential victory into a probable defeat and a publicity disaster. As I am recording this episode, the prestige of the United States and even that of Israel has been severely dented. Their supposed omnipotence has been revealed as impotence when the adversary refuses to be intimidated. And the Western media's extraordinary ability to evoke non-existent realities probably will not change things. But returning to Trump, there are elements in his persona that, at least in my view, bring to mind the character of King Lear, as described in the play, or rather the tragedy that bears his name. There are some parallels, but also dramatic differences. In the video shown here, Trump apparently seems to assume the questionable role of a questionable fundamentalist evangelist of an equally questionable biblical prophet, reading or quoting from the Old Testament. The whole apparently aimed at displaying a sudden spiritual or religious penchant that may startle some of Trump's fans. The speech is somewhat blurry at times, but it is difficult not to detect in the video Trump's implied self-appointment as a New Age evangelist and defender of Israel.
Saying, "There shall not fail you as a man to be ruler in Israel. But if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set before you, and shall go and serve other gods and worship them, then will I pluck them up from the roots out of my land which I have given them, and this house which I have sanctified for my name will I cast out of my sight, and will make it to be a proverb and a byword among nations. And this house which is high,
which in turn brings to mind some lines from the play As You Like It, lines that characterize and refer to the 7 stages in which can be divided the average life of man, from which lines I quote at the beginning. All the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his times plays many parts, his act being 7 ages. I then skip the first 6 ages and quote the lines corresponding to the 7th age. Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childish and mere oblivion. Of course, poetical parallels are never completely accurate, but there can be hints expressed in a few words. What Trump and Shakespeare's King Lear have in common is, of course, the age. The viewer can or cannot decide whether the Shakespearean lines that I just quoted apply to the character in question, Trump, namely childishness and or oblivion. At the beginning of the play, King Lear decides that it is time to retire and delivers what today we would call a retirement speech that begins as follows. It is our fast intent to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger strengths, while we, unburdened, crawl towards death. With King Lear, his end is made more tragic as only in his last days he learns to appreciate certain values in life that, until then, had either escaped his attention or his interest. Or, alternatively, his mind has been so captured by his position of authority that anything outside the scope of the display of dominion or power was believed to be useless or irrelevant. Lear had 3 daughters, 2 of which were despicable and only interested in power and their own inheritance. The good one was the third, Cordelia, who initially refuses to engage in the competition of adulations with the other sisters, the winner of which the competition would have been the one who delivers the most sycophantic and exaggerated praises of King Lear. Cordelia, as I said, refuses to join the silly competition, whereupon Lear disinherits her on the spot and bans her from his court. In the course of the play, the 2 sickly asters, the 2 ugly sisters, show themselves for what they are, characters only interested in power and gold. But in unexpected turn of events, at the end of the tragedy, King Lear finds himself prisoner of a traitor, along with his devoted and faithful daughter Cordelia. Yet in prison, Lear realizes that the value of pretense, power, display, vanity, ambition, and pride is relative, and that contentment can be found in aspects of life normally overlooked or hidden behind the gloss of pomp and circumstance. Whereupon, even in the prison where he finds himself, along with the only faithful daughter Cordelia, he realizes the psychological positive value of actions and activities that in his life as a king he had never considered or assumed, or perhaps assumed that they were below his status. Anticipating how to spend life in prison with Cordelia, he says, "So we live and pray and sing and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies and hear poor Rose talk of court news, and we'll talk with them too, who loses and who wins, who's in, who's out, and take upon us the mystery of things, as if we were God's spies. And we'll wear out, in a walled prison, pacts and sects of great ones that ebb and flow by the moon." Shakespeareanly speaking, it is possible to find some parallels, but also an abyss between the two characters, King Lear and Trump. The pacts and sects of great ones that ebb and flow by the moon, we can see them 24 hours a day parading on television screens. But it is only by taking an unbiased, objective, independent, personal, and analytical view of events that we can hope to take upon us the mystery of things, while injecting distance between our own souls and the littleness, greed, pretense, and even disgust of some of those who, as Henry V observed, ride the tide of pomp that beats upon the high shores of the world. But I will end this episode in a somewhat different vein. By now, all the world knows of the movie Melania, whose objective of production remains unknown, but that, as far as the size of the attracted audience was below expectations, to be euphemistic. And here are a few comments by the media. I cannot understand the nothing things she says. This is the reviewer from the Variety magazine. It should be considered a war crime, according to the Hollywood Reporter. For the New York Times, it's like being taken hostage by the Taliban. And for another reviewer, if Epstein really killed himself, watching this film may have been the reason why. By the way, another meaningful character in the play Troilus and Cressida is called Pander, wherefrom we have the verb to pander, which in turn is a euphemism for a profession that until recently did not enjoy a stellar reputation, namely the procurer of ladies. Today, pander would be a model agent, and by this renaming, a pander still panders to the vices of the rich and vicious, but he has become a model agent, a position that, in turn, offers unusual prospects of advancement. In fact, a modeling agent can even become and has become an official ambassador of the United States, a tradition that may not spring to mind from a background of pandering, that is, a background in model agency. From the depths of my distant and youthful 8 years of Latin, a sentence returns to mind: tempora mutant et nos mutamur in illis, meaning times change and we change with the times. And changes occur even in places and with professions where we may have not thought that it could happen. Where I live, I have sometimes occasions to return to town via a road located in an industrial section, a road lined exclusively with large industrial sheds and warehouses. The only establishment remaining open and illuminated at night is a bar offering drinks and mixed entertainment. It promotes its presence and business with very large neon lights, very bright lights that stand out at night against the darkness of the closed and massive industrial buildings. For a long time, the neon lights of the business in question simply said bar strippers. But returning to town not long ago, I couldn't help noticing that the neon lights had changed, and now instead of saying bar strippers, they said bar models. And the modeling agent can even become, these days, an official ambassador of the United States, an association that may not directly spring to mind with a background in pandering. Oops, a background in model agencies. Indeed, times change, and we change with the times. Thank you for watching, and may all the numbers of the stars give light to your fair way.